He called the boy a beggar and told him to rot in the streets. He didn't know this street kid was about to buy the entire bank just to fire him. Stay until the end, because the moment the account balance hits the screen, the manager's life is over. The heavy glass doors of First National Heritage Bank in the heart of Chicago didn't just open. They hissed, a sound of expensive air escaping into the smoggy city streets. Inside, the lobby was a cathedral of wealth. White marble floors polished to a mirror shine, brass railings that glowed like gold, and the scent of old money and cold efficiency. Julian Vance, the branch manager, stood at the center of this kingdom. To Julian, the world was divided into two types of people, those who belonged on the marble and those who belonged in the dirt. He adjusted his $500 silk tie, his eyes scanning the room for anything that ruined the aesthetic of his high-end sanctuary. That's when he saw the flaw. A small boy, no older than 10, stood at the mahogany counter. His name was Caleb Rivers. Caleb didn't look like the children of the investors who usually grace these halls. He was wearing a thrift store jacket 3 sizes too large, the sleeves frayed and swallowing his small, trembling hands. But it was his shoes that were an insult to the marble. They were worn-out sneakers with soles so cracked they looked like parched earth, held together by frayed laces and a prayer. "Excuse me, sir," Caleb whispered, his voice small, echoing against the 40-foot ceilings. "I'd like to check my account balance, please." Julian Vance didn't respond immediately. He took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the silence stretch until it became painful. He looked Caleb up and down, from the messy hair to the dirt-stained shoes, and then he did something that chilled the air. He laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the quiet of the bank like a blade. "Check your account," Julian's voice boomed, amplified by the marble acoustics so every wealthy client in the building could hear. "Son, look around you. This is First National Heritage. We manage portfolios, not lunch money. This isn't a welfare office for street kids." Caleb flinched as if he'd been struck. "But sir, I have an account, my grandmother." "Your grandmother?" Julian interrupted, stepping closer. The sharp sting of his expensive cologne clashed with the boy's scent of rain and poverty. Julian leaned in, his face twisting into a sneer of theatrical disgust. "Let me guess. Your grandmother is a secret duchess who left you a fortune in a shoebox." A ripple of laughter moved through the lobby. It started with a woman in a designer suit holding a gold-plated leash, and soon the entire room was united in their cruelty. A wealthy man behind Caleb groaned loudly, "Throw the brat out already. He's stinking up the place and wasting our time." Julian smiled, fueled by the approval of his real customers. He signaled for the security guard, a man named Jerome Davis, who started moving toward the boy with a heavy, reluctant stride. "You people are all the same," Julian hissed, his voice dropping to a low, poisonous register. "Looking for a handout, thinking you can walk into a place like this and pretend you matter. Get out before I have you arrested for trespassing." Caleb didn't run, he didn't scream. Just like his grandma Alina had taught him, he stood his ground. His heart was thudding against his ribs like a trapped bird, and his vision was blurring with hot, shameful tears, but he didn't move. "I'm not a thief," Caleb said, his voice trembling but refusing to break. "I have an account, my grandmother. She passed away 2 months ago. She told me to come here." He reached into his oversized jacket and pulled out a battered, brown envelope. Inside were the only things he had left of her: a bank card, a letter, and a handful of legal documents. Julian didn't take the envelope gently. He snatched it with a rough jerk, his eyes scanning the documents with bored contempt. He was already forming the words to humiliate the boy further, to send him back to the streets with nothing but the clothes on his back. But then Julian saw the bank card. It wasn't the standard blue or silver card given to common depositors. It was a heavy, midnight black card with silver lettering, a platinum reserve card. In his 15 years of banking, Julian had only seen 3 of them. They were reserved for the titans of industry, the families that essentially own the city. For one split second, the sneer vanished. A flicker of pure, unadulterated doubt crossed Julian's face. The air in the lobby seemed to freeze. Could it be? Was this child more than he seemed? But Julian Vance was a man blinded by his own prejudice. He looked at the card, then back at Caleb's cracked, dirt-caked sneakers. The math didn't add up in his narrow mind. "Where did you steal this?" Julian demanded, his voice returning with a vengeful edge. He held the card up high, showing it to the watching crowd like a trophy. "A black kid from the projects with a reserve card? You really expect me to believe your grandma was a member of the elite?" "I didn't steal it," Caleb cried out, the first sob finally escaping his throat. "It's mine. It has my name on it." Julian laughed again, but this time it was darker. He threw the card onto the marble counter, letting it skid across the surface like trash. "I know a fraud when I see one, kid," Julian barked. He pointed toward the far corner of the bank, a shadowed area near the janitor's closet and the bathroom entrance, the coldest, most humiliating spot in the building. "Sit over there. Don't move. Don't speak. I'm calling headquarters to see just how long you'll be spending in juvenile detention for this stunt." Caleb lowered his head, his shoulders hunching as if he could disappear into his large jacket. He walked to the corner, every step in his worn-out shoes feeling heavier than the last. He sat on the hard metal chair, surrounded by the gold and marble of a world that was currently trying to crush him. He reached into his pocket and touched the letter one more time. He didn't know it yet, but the man who had just insulted him was about to experience a fall so fast, the marble floor wouldn't be able to catch him. Caleb pulled out his phone, a cracked, ancient device. He saw a text from his Uncle Lawrence. "Stuck in a meeting. Be there in 20 minutes. You're doing great, champ." Julian Vance was still smirking at his wealthy clients, unaware that in exactly 20 minutes, his life as he knew it would be over. Caleb sat on the cold metal chair, his back against the rough texture of the wallpaper near the janitor's closet. He felt like a ghost in a house of gold. To his left, a fountain gurgled with pristine water, a symbol of the abundance that surrounded him, yet he felt a thirst that water couldn't quench, a thirst for respect. Across the lobby, Julian Vance was putting on a performance. He wasn't just working, he was posturing. He leaned over the mahogany desks of his wealthy clients, whispering jokes, his laughter loud and forced, designed to let everyone know that he had handled the disturbance. Every time his eyes flickered toward the corner where Caleb sat, they hardened into icy slits of contempt. Julian walked over to Sarah Miller, the head teller. She was a woman who had spent 20 years climbing the corporate ladder, and she had learned that the easiest way to stay on it was to agree with whoever was standing above her. "Has the street prince moved yet?" Julian sneered, loud enough for the nearby customers to hear. Sarah glanced at Caleb, then back at Julian with a thin, sharp smile. "No, sir. He's just sitting there, clutching that envelope like it's a golden ticket. Honestly, the nerve of some people. He probably found that card in a trash can outside a real billionaire's house." Julian chuckled, adjusting his cufflinks. "I've already flagged the account as suspicious activity. I'm not even going to run the balance yet. I want to wait for the police to arrive. If we run the card and it's stolen, the system might alert the actual owner, and I want to be the one who tells them First National Heritage caught the thief. It'll look great on my quarterly review." What Julian didn't realize was that the system was already watching him. Back in the corner, Caleb looked down at his shoes. He remembered the day his grandma Alina bought them. They hadn't been new then, they were from a church basement sale. But she had polished them until they shone, telling him, "Caleb, these shoes will take you to places I can only dream of. Don't you ever let the mud of this world stay on you." He felt a shadow fall over him. He looked up. It was Marcus Thorne, the security guard. Marcus was a tall man, his uniform pressed and sharp, but his eyes were weary. He looked at Caleb, then at the manager, then back at the boy. "You okay, kid?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the lobby's hum. "I didn't steal it, Mr. Guard," Caleb said, his lip trembling. "My grandma, she worked 3 jobs. She was a nurse's aide, a cleaner, and she baked pies for the market. She told me this was for my college. She told me I belonged here." Marcus felt a sharp pang in his chest. He saw his own son in Caleb's eyes. He saw the struggle of 1,000 grandmothers who had spent their lives scrubbing floors so their grandsons could stand on marble. He looked at Julian Vance, the man who had never skipped a meal or missed a promotion, and felt a wave of nausea. "Keep your head up," Marcus whispered. "The truth has a way of coming out, just stay quiet for now." But Julian saw the interaction. "Thorne," he barked from across the room, "I don't pay you to socialize with the evidence. Get back to the door and make sure no more undesirables wander in." Marcus tightened his jaw, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his belt. He nodded once and walked away, the weight of his silence feeling like a lead vest. Julian then turned his attention back to his computer. He decided to do a preliminary search on the name associated with the card. He typed in Alina Rivers. The screen didn't load immediately. Instead, a security prompt appeared. "Access restricted. Level 5 clearance required." Julian frowned. Level 5? That was reserved for the board of directors and the primary shareholders. He felt a bead of sweat form at his hairline. It must be a glitch, he thought. A woman who lived in the projects doesn't have level 5 clearance. He bypassed the prompt using his manager's override, a tool he was only supposed to use for emergencies. The screen flickered and a single file opened. There were no photos, just a list of assets. Julian's eyes scanned the list. His breath hitched. Real estate holdings, 12 properties in downtown Chicago, trust accounts, diverse portfolio. Primary beneficiary, Caleb Elias Rivers. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. But then a dark thought entered his mind, a thought born of arrogance. No, this is impossible. This must be a different Alina Rivers. A coincidence. The boy is just a puppet for some scam artist who used a dead woman's name. He closed the file quickly, his heart hammering. He couldn't admit he was wrong. Not now. Not in front of the people he had just entertained with his victory. If he admitted he had humiliated a billionaire's heir, his career would be over by lunch. He looked at the clock. 10:45 a.m. "Sarah," Julian called out, his voice slightly higher than usual. "Call the police again. Tell them we have a high-stakes identity thief in the lobby. Tell them to bring handcuffs." Caleb heard the word handcuffs, and his heart nearly stopped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cracked phone. He sent one more text to his Uncle Lawrence. "Uncle, please hurry. The man is calling the police. I'm scared." Across town, in a skyscraper made of black glass, a phone vibrated on a heavy oak table. Lawrence Elias Rivers, the man the world knew as the Vulture of Wall Street for the way he dismantled corrupt companies, picked up the phone. He read the text. His eyes, usually calm and calculating, turned into obsidian. He looked at the executives sitting around him. "The meeting is over," Elias said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. "But Mr. Rivers," one executive stammered, "we haven't signed the merger." Elias stood up, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. My nephew is at First National, and someone there just made the biggest mistake of their life. I don't sign mergers with people who hire monsters. Back at the bank, Julian Vance was walking toward Caleb, a smug grin returning to his face. He felt powerful again. He was going to end this. He was going to prove that the world worked exactly the way he thought it did. "Stand up, kid," Julian commanded. "The police are 2 minutes away. It's time to go back to where you came from." Caleb stood up. He felt small, but he remembered his grandmother's voice. "Character makes the man, Caleb." He looked Julian straight in the eyes. "My shoes might be torn, sir," Caleb said, his voice now steady and clear. "But my hands are clean. Can you say the same?" The lobby went silent. The wealthy customers paused. Julian's face turned a deep, angry purple. He raised his hand, pointing a trembling finger at the door. "Out! Get out now!" But at that exact moment, the heavy glass doors didn't just hiss. They slammed open. The air in the lobby changed. It didn't just feel cold anymore. It felt electric. A man in a suit that seemed to absorb the light walked in, his footsteps sounding like thunder on the marble. Behind him, 2 men in dark suits followed, their faces expressionless. Marcus, the guard, stood at attention, his eyes widening. He recognized the man. Everyone in the financial world recognized that face. Julian Vance froze. His hand was still pointing at the door, still pointing at Caleb. "I believe," Elias Rivers said, his voice echoing like a final judgment, "you were just telling my nephew to leave." The silence that followed was the sound of a man's life falling apart. The heavy glass doors of the lobby didn't just open. They seemed to buckle under the sheer weight of the man who stepped through them. Elias Rivers moved with the kind of absolute authority that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. Behind him, 2 men in dark suits followed, their faces like stone, but it was the woman beside him who made the air in the bank turn to ice. Patricia Edwards, the regional director of First National Heritage, walked with a sharp, rhythmic click of her heels, a sound that, to Julian Vance's ears, sounded like a ticking time bomb. Julian's hand was still raised, finger pointed toward the door in a gesture of expulsion. He froze. The smug grin that had been plastered on his face just seconds ago shattered like cheap glass. He looked at Patricia, then at the towering figure of Elias, and finally his eyes dropped to the small, trembling hand clutched in Elias' grip. The beggar was holding hands with the king. "I believe," Elias said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to shake the very marble beneath their feet. "You were just telling my nephew where his natural environment was." Julian's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a man drowning on dry land. The wealthy customers who had been laughing moments ago suddenly found intense interest in the floor tiles. The silence was so thick you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "Ms. Edwards," Julian finally stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. What a surprise. We weren't expecting an investor visit until next week." Patricia Edwards didn't smile. She didn't offer a hand. She looked at Julian with a disgust so pure it made him flinch. "I'm sure you weren't, Julian. If you had checked your emails instead of performing for the lobby, you might have known we were already on our way." She turned to Elias, her tone shifting to one of profound apology. "Mr. Rivers, I am beyond words. This is not how we represent this institution." Elias didn't look at her. His obsidian eyes were locked on Julian. "Institutional representation is a corporate phrase, Patricia. What I see is a man who thinks a pair of $2 shoes determines the value of a human soul." Elias knelt down in front of Caleb, ignoring the $1,000 fabric of his suit as it touched the floor. He reached out and gently took the brown envelope from the boy's shaking hands. "Did he touch her letter, Caleb?" Elias asked softly. He snatched it, Uncle, Caleb whispered, a single tear finally escaping and tracking through the dust on his cheek. He said Grandma probably robbed a bank to get the card. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Elias stood up slowly, the movement so fluid it was predatory. He turned to Julian. My mother, Elena Rivers, taught in the public school system for 40 years. She wore those ugly sneakers and rode the bus in the rain so she could save every cent for this boy's future. He stepped into Julian's personal space, forcing the manager to press his back against the mahogany counter. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment with a broken heater so that one day her grandson could walk into a place like this and be treated with the dignity she earned for him. And you treated him like a criminal because he didn't fit your aesthetic. Julian's face was the color of sour milk. I was just following protocol, sir. He had no ID. He had his school ID, Elias barked, the sudden volume making the senior teller, Sarah Miller, jump so hard she dropped her gold pen. He had a platinum reserve card that bears our family name, a name that, I might remind you, is on the deed to this very building. Patricia Edwards stepped forward, her voice like a guillotine blade. Julian, the Platinum Reserve accounts are flagged for immediate VIP handling regardless of the bearer's age. It is a level 5 security protocol. Why was this not followed? Julian looked at Sarah, silently begging for help, but Sarah was staring at her monitor, her fingers flying across the keys as she tried to distance herself from the wreckage. I thought it was a scam, Julian whispered, his bravado completely evaporated. You see these kids every day trying to pull things. No, Elias interrupted, his voice dropping back to that terrifying, calm low. You didn't see a scammer. You saw a black kid in torn shoes and you decided he was nobody. Elias turned back to his nephew and pointed at the computer screen on the main counter. Caleb, come here. I want you to see what Grandma did for you. Caleb walked forward, his worn-out sneakers squeaking on the marble that had previously seemed so hostile. Sarah Miller stepped aside, her head bowed in shame. The screen flickered, the numbers loaded. Account balance, $487,263. The lobby, which had been a theater of mockery, was now a tomb of silence. The wealthy woman who had complained about Caleb, stinking up the place, now stood frozen, her eyes wide as she stared at the $500,000 balance of the boy she had called a beggar. Caleb stared at the screen. He thought of his grandma's kitchen, the smell of cinnamon, and the way she used to tape her own glasses together so he could have new notebooks for school. It wasn't just money on that screen. It was 40 years of sacrifice. It was every bus ride she took in the cold. It was every meal she skipped. She saved all that. For me, Caleb whispered, his voice thick with wonder. Every single penny, Elias replied, his hand resting firmly on Caleb's shoulder. And this man tried to tell you that you didn't belong in the presence of your own inheritance. Julian Vance tried one last, desperate plea. Mr. Rivers, please. I have a career. I've been here 15 years. Patricia Edwards didn't even look at him. She was already writing on a tablet. 15 years, Julian. In 15 minutes, you managed to expose this bank to a massive civil rights lawsuit and insult our primary shareholder. She looked up at the security guard, Marcus Thorne, who was standing at the edge of the scene, his jaw set, his eyes finally meeting Caleb's with a look of pure, unbridled pride. Officer Thorne, Patricia commanded, please escort Mr. Vance to his office to collect his personal items. His access credentials are to be revoked immediately. Julian's knees buckled. The man who had spent the morning acting like the king of the marble was now being led away by the very guard he had treated like a servant. As Julian passed Caleb, he looked for mercy. But Caleb didn't give him anger, and he didn't give him pity. He simply stood tall, clutching his grandmother's letter to his chest. The point of no return had been crossed. The balance had been settled. But for Caleb, the real story was only just beginning. The lobby of the bank had become a frozen tableau. While Julian Vance, or Bradley Whitmore, as his nameplate read, was being marched toward the back offices in a daze of ruined ambition, Elias Rivers led Caleb toward a private seating area. The boy, still clutching the frayed brown envelope, looked around at the marble and the glass with eyes that had seen too much for a 10-year-old. "Uncle Elias," Caleb whispered, his voice small against the echoes of the high ceilings. "Why did Grandma never tell me? Why did she let people look at us like that, if she had all this?" Elias sat on the edge of a velvet chair, leaning in so that the world outside their circle disappeared. "Because your grandmother knew something those people will never understand, Caleb. She knew that money is a tool, but character is a shield. She didn't want you to be a boy who relied on a bank balance. She wanted you to be a man who relied on himself." Elias reached into the envelope and pulled out the letter Caleb had been reading. He didn't just read the words, he felt the history behind them. "Let me tell you about the teacher from Lincoln Elementary," Elias began, his voice dropping into a rhythmic, storytelling cadence. For 40 years, Elena Rivers had been the first person to arrive at that school and the last to leave. The bank manager had mocked her life, calling her a drug dealer or a thief, because he couldn't fathom a black woman from the projects having $500,000 without a crime. But the crime was his own lack of imagination. Elena's secret wasn't a heist. It was a slow, painful, beautiful sacrifice. Elias described the nights he remembered as a boy. The sound of his mother's sewing machine running at 2:00 a.m. because she was fixing neighbors' clothes for extra $5 bills. He told Caleb about the magic jar in the kitchen, where every penny found on the street, every tip from her summer tutoring jobs, and every cent saved by walking instead of taking the bus was placed. "She wore that same winter coat for 15 years, Caleb," Elias said, his eyes misting over. "The zipper was broken, and she used a safety pin to keep it closed. I offered to buy her a new one a dozen times once I became successful. You know what she told me? She'd say, 'Elias, that coat still keeps the wind out, and a new coat won't pay for Caleb's medical school.'" Caleb looked down at his own shoes, the cracked soles and frayed laces that had been the catalyst for his humiliation. He remembered how Grandma Elena would kneel on the linoleum floor, her joints creaking, to tie those laces. She had bought them for $2 at a thrift store. At the time, Caleb had been ashamed. He wanted the Nikes he saw in the commercials. "She knew they were mocking her shoes in this very lobby years ago," Elias continued. "I came with her once when I was your age. A teller not unlike that woman Sarah made her wait for an hour while they helped preferred clients. My mother sat there with her back straight, her head high, and her worn-out shoes tucked neatly under the chair. She told me later, 'Elias, they see the shoes, but God sees the journey. Don't ever let their eyes change how you see yourself.'" Elias pulled a small, black ledger from the envelope, something Caleb hadn't noticed before. It was a handwritten record of every deposit Elena had made since the day Caleb was born. June 12th, Caleb born, $50. August 1st, pie sale profits, $22.40. December 24th, Christmas bonus, $100. Entry after entry, spanning a decade. It was a map of a woman's love. Every dollar was a choice to skip a movie, a choice to eat beans and rice for the third night in a row, a choice to invest in a future she knew she would never live to see. "This bank thinks they are the ones who hold the wealth," Elias said, his voice regaining its edge. "But they are bankrupt. They have no honor. They have no memory. They saw a kid in raggedy shoes and saw a zero. They didn't see 40 years of the American dream being built one penny at a time. Caleb ran his fingers over the shaky handwriting in the ledger. He realized that the Platinum Reserve card wasn't just a piece of plastic that gave him access to money. It was a medal of honor. It was proof that his grandmother had won. She had beaten the system that tried to keep her small. Suddenly, the door to the manager's office creaked open. Patricia Edwards stepped out, her face a mask of professional fury. She looked at the senior teller, Sarah Miller, who was still trying to look busy at her station. "Sarah," Patricia said, her voice cutting through the lobby like a laser. "I suggest you start clearing your desk. You didn't just stand by, you encouraged the abuse of a minor and a client. Silence in the face of injustice is an endorsement." Sarah's face went white. Bradley told me. "Bradley is currently being escorted out by the police for falsifying an incident report," Patricia snapped. "And you will follow him shortly." Caleb watched the woman who had smirked at him now tremble in fear. He didn't feel the joy he thought he would. He felt a deep, hollow sadness. He looked at his uncle. "Grandma said dignity is carried, not given. Does that mean even they have it somewhere?" Elias looked at the disgraced employees. "They chose to put theirs down a long time ago, Caleb. They traded it for a title and a silk tie. Today, they realized the price of that trade was far too high." As the sun began to dip lower, casting long, golden shadows across the marble floor, the waiting game was over. The deep dive into the past had revealed a treasure far greater than the $487,263 on the screen. It had revealed that Caleb Rivers was the heir to a dynasty of strength. "Come on, champ," Elias said, standing up and smoothing his suit. "We have one more stop to make before we go home." "Where?" Caleb asked. "To the thrift store on 5th, Elias smiled. "I think it's time we buy every pair of shoes they have and give them to kids who need to walk as tall as you do today." The news of what happened at First National Heritage didn't stay within the marble walls. In the digital age, a scandal travels faster than the truth. A bystander, a young college student who had been sitting near the back, had captured the moment Julian Vance pointed his finger at Caleb's shoes on video. By the time Elias, Rivers, and Caleb stepped out onto the sidewalk, the video had already begun to circulate under the headline, "The Price of Prejudice." But for Julian Vance, the nightmare was just beginning. As he was being led to the employee exit by Marcus Thorne, Julian's shock turned into a desperate, volatile anger. He wasn't a man used to losing. He had spent his life playing a game where the person with the loudest voice and the most expensive suit won. "Get your hands off me, Thorne," Julian hissed as they reached the back alley. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? Seeing a man like me brought down by a street urchin and a diversity hire like Patricia." Marcus stopped. He didn't let go of Julian's arm, but he tightened his grip just enough to make the former manager wince. Marcus looked at the brick wall of the alley, then slowly turned his gaze to Julian. "You still don't get it, do you, Julian?" Marcus said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "You think this is about luck or politics, but that boy, he had more dignity in his pinky finger than you've had in 15 years of banking. I didn't see a street kid. I saw a mirror, and today the mirror broke you." Marcus shoved him toward the street where Julian's silver luxury sedan sat idling. Julian stumbled, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. "This isn't over. I have connections. I know the board. I'll have your badge by tomorrow morning." But as Julian reached for his car door, he saw a group of people standing on the sidewalk. They weren't his wealthy clients. They were ordinary people, a delivery driver, a shopkeeper from across the street, and a group of teenagers. They were holding their phones up. "Hey, isn't that the guy from the video?" a young girl shouted. "The one who mocked the kids' shoes." The crowd began to close in, not with violence, but with the suffocating weight of public judgment. Julian, the man who lived for the approval of the elite, found himself being looked at with the same disgust he had shown Caleb. He scrambled into his car, tires screeching as he fled the scene, leaving behind a cloud of exhaust and a shattered reputation. Back inside the bank, the first real confrontation was taking place in the boardroom. Patricia Edwards sat across from the bank's legal counsel. The air was thick with the scent of panic. "We have to settle," the lawyer whispered. "Elias Rivers isn't just a shareholder, he's the face of Meridian Capital. If he pulls his assets, this branch closes by Friday. And if that kid's story hits the national news, we're looking at a boycott that could tank the stock." Patricia leaned back, her eyes cold. Julian Vance didn't just break policy, he broke the soul of this branch. "I want a full audit of every account he flagged as suspicious over the last 5 years. I want to know how many other Calebs he turned away." Suddenly, the doors swung open. Elias Rivers walked in, but he wasn't alone. He was holding Caleb's hand, and behind them stood a man with a camera and a microphone, Dominic Vance, no relation to Julian, a hard-hitting investigative journalist for the Chicago Chronicle. "Mr. Rivers," Patricia said, standing up quickly, "this is a private meeting." "Nothing is private anymore, Patricia," Elias said, his voice echoing with the authority of a judge. "The confrontation you should be worried about isn't with me, it's with the truth." Elias looked at the lawyer, then at the camera. "My nephew was asked to leave because his shoes were torn. Well, I've decided that if this bank doesn't like his shoes, they shouldn't like my money either." "Elias, please," Patricia pleaded. "We fired him, we're doing everything we can." "It's not enough to fire a monster," Elias countered. "You have to change the cage. Caleb, tell them what you told me in the car." Caleb stepped forward. He looked small in the massive boardroom, surrounded by mahogany and leather, but his voice was steady. "I don't want your money," Caleb said, looking Patricia in the eye. "My grandma already gave me everything I need, but I saw the other people in the lobby. They were laughing. They thought it was okay to laugh at a kid because he looked poor." Caleb pointed toward the lobby doors. "I want a sign, right there on the front door. I want it to say that in this bank, your character is the only currency that matters. And I want you to start a program, a scholarship for kids who have the grades but don't have the shoes." The boardroom went silent. The lawyers looked at each other. It was a PR nightmare's dream solution, but it was also a radical shift in power. "If you do that," Elias added, "I keep my assets here. If not, I spend the afternoon moving every cent to a credit union that actually knows how to treat a human being." This was the first confrontation of the new era. It wasn't about a manager being fired. It was about a system being challenged. Patricia Edwards looked at the boy with the thrift store jacket and the cracked sneakers, and realized that he had more leverage than any CEO she had ever met. "Consider it done," Patricia whispered. But as they walked out, Elias caught a glimpse of Julian's silver car circling the block. Julian wasn't going away quietly. He felt cheated. He felt that a kid like Caleb shouldn't have the power to destroy a man like him. The confrontation wasn't over. It was moving from the boardroom to the streets. Julian was dialed into a phone call with a contact in the city's darker corners, a man who specialized in fixing reputations by ruining others. "I need you to find dirt on that family," Julian hissed into his phone, his eyes bloodshot with rage. "I don't care if you have to invent it. That kid, that heir, I want him to wish he had never walked into my bank." The war had begun, and Caleb Rivers, with his grandmother's letter tucked into his pocket, was standing at the center of a storm he didn't yet understand. The victory in the boardroom felt like a sunrise, But as evening fell over the city of Chicago, a different kind of darkness began to crawl into the life of Caleb Rivers. Julian Vance, now stripped of his title, his office, and his dignity, sat in the dimly lit corner of a dive bar 3 blocks away from the bank. His silk tie was loosened, his expensive suit jacket stained with sweat. He wasn't thinking about the lives he had stepped on. He was thinking about revenge. He pulled out his phone and made a call to a man known only as the Fixer. "I need a story," Julian hissed into the receiver. "That kid, Caleb Rivers, and his hero, Uncle Elias, I want them buried. I want the world to believe that money was stolen. I want people to think that Grandma Alina was a front for a money laundering operation. If I'm going down, I'm dragging their legacy into the gutter with me." Within hours, the machinery of malice began to turn. Back at the small apartment where Caleb lived with his Aunt May, the atmosphere was heavy. Despite the millions in the bank, they hadn't moved yet. Aunt May insisted that wealth shouldn't change the soul until the heart is ready. But as they sat down for dinner, the peace was shattered. A loud, aggressive rhythmic pounding echoed against their front door. Caleb jumped, his heart racing. He looked at his aunt, whose face had turned a ghostly pale. When she opened the door, she wasn't met with neighbors or friends. She was met with a swarm of flashing lights and men in dark windbreakers with Internal Revenue Service, criminal investigation, printed in bold white letters. "May Rivers?" a man with a cold, robotic voice asked. "We have a warrant to seize all financial records and electronic devices associated with the estate of Alina Rivers. We've received a tip regarding a high-level fraud and identity theft ring." Caleb watched in horror as the men pushed past his aunt. They didn't care about the sanctity of their home. They tossed the couch cushions where he used to sit with his grandma. They ripped the old, taped-up books from the shelves. But the worst part came when they reached for the brown envelope, the one containing the letter. "No," Caleb screamed, lunging forward. "That's my grandma. You can't take that." A large agent blocked his path, his hand resting on a holster. "Stay back, kid. This is federal property now. We have reports that this inheritance was built on illegal offshore transfers. Your uncle, Elias Rivers, is currently being detained for questioning at the airport." The world tilted. In a single hour, the triumph of the bank had been turned into a nightmare. This was Julian's plan, to make the truth look like a lie. If he could freeze the accounts and smear the family name, the bank would be forced to reconsider his firing, and the public would turn their backs on the miracle kid. Caleb sat on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of his living room. He felt smaller than he ever had in the bank lobby. The news was already breaking on the television in the corner. Breaking news. The bank boy miracle under fire. Federal authorities investigate the Rivers family for potential $20 million fraud. Is the viral video just a cover for a criminal empire? The comment sections, once filled with heart emojis and support, were now a battlefield of doubt. "I knew it was too good to be true," one user wrote. "Just another scam," said another. Caleb looked at his aunt. She was weeping quietly, clutching a photo of Alina to her chest. The weight of the world was pressing down on them. The silence in the apartment was deafening, the silence of a family being erased. Caleb walked to the window. Outside, the rain was starting to fall, blurring the city lights. He looked down at his shoes, the same torn sneakers. He felt like a fool for ever thinking he was special. He felt like the world had finally won. But then, he remembered the secret his grandmother told him during one of those long bus rides in the winter. "Caleb," she had whispered, "the dark is only there to show you where the light is coming from. When they try to bury you, remember, you are a seed. You were born to grow through the dirt." Caleb reached into his pocket. The agents had taken the envelope, but they hadn't searched his jacket thoroughly. His fingers brushed against a small, hard object. It was a thumb drive, the one his Uncle Elias had handed him in the car, telling him to keep it safe, just in case. Elias Rivers hadn't become a billionaire by being naive. He knew that men like Julian Vance didn't go away, they rotted. And he had been collecting the rot for years. Caleb didn't know how to use the files on that drive, but he knew who did. He looked at the television screen. The reporter, Dominic Vance, was still on the air, looking skeptical about the police raid. Caleb didn't wait for his aunt to stop crying. He didn't wait for the rain to stop. He grabbed his oversized jacket, laced up his torn shoes, and slipped out the back door into the shadows. This was the darkest hour, the hour where hope goes to die. But as Caleb ran through the rain toward the downtown office of the Chicago Chronicle, he wasn't a victim anymore. He was a messenger. Julian Vance thought he had ended the story. He didn't realize he had just reached the climax. In the distance, a siren wailed, and the city watched as a small boy in raggedy shoes sprinted against the wind, carrying the only thing that could burn the lies to the ground. The rain turned the Chicago skyline into a blurred watercolor of gray and neon, but Caleb Rivers didn't feel the cold. His lungs burned as he sprinted toward the Chicago Chronicle building, his torn shoes splashing through deep puddles. In his pocket, the thumb drive felt like a hot coal. He knew the IRS raid wasn't about taxes, it was about silence. Julian Vance was trying to kill the truth before it could speak. Caleb burst through the revolving doors of the newsroom, a dripping, shivering mess of a boy. Security tried to stop him, but Dominic Vance, the journalist, was already walking through the lobby. He saw the look in Caleb's eyes, the look of a soldier returning from a battle he refused to lose. "Caleb, what are you doing here? I just saw the news about the raid," Dominic said, pulling the boy into his office and draping a dry coat over his shoulders. "It's a lie, Mr. Dominic," Caleb panted, reaching into his pocket. "My Uncle Elias. He knew they would come for us. He gave me this. He said if anything happened to him, I had to bring this to someone who isn't afraid of the bank." Dominic took the drive and plugged it into his workstation. For a few minutes, the only sound in the room was the hum of the computer and the rain hitting the glass. Then, the files opened. Dominic's eyes widened. My God. The drive didn't just contain Grandma Aliner's bank records. It contained a hidden folder titled The Vance Files. For years, Julian Vance had been skimming small percentages from inactive accounts belonging to elderly or deceased clients who had no heirs. He targeted people he thought were invisible, just like he thought Caleb was invisible. He used the bank's internal system to flag minority-owned accounts for random audits to cover his tracks. But there was more. The anonymous tip to the IRS hadn't come from a concerned citizen. It had come from Julian's personal laptop, sent via an encrypted server he thought was untraceable. He had fabricated the money laundering documents and planted them in the bank's digital archive minutes before he was fired. "Caleb," Dominic said, his voice trembling with excitement. "This isn't just a story about a bank manager being mean. This is a story about a criminal empire, and your grandmother. She was the only one who noticed the discrepancies in her monthly statements. That's why she saved everything. She was building a case." While the news was still painting Caleb's family as criminals, Dominic began to type. He didn't just write an article, he prepared a digital strike. He bypassed the local censors and sent the raw data to the federal prosecutors who had been misled. Meanwhile, at the police station, Elias Rivers sat in an interrogation room. He was calm. He looked at the detectives who were trying to break him. "You think you caught a shark," Elias said quietly, "but you're just holding the net while the ocean rises behind you." Suddenly, the lead detective's phone buzzed. Then the other detectives. Then the TV in the corner of the station flipped from the fraud scandal to a breaking live broadcast from Dominic Vance. "We have obtained exclusive evidence," Dominic's voice boomed from the screen. "That proves the allegations against the Rivers family were a coordinated frame-up by former manager Julian Vance to hide a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. We have the logs. We have the IP addresses. And we have the proof that Alina Rivers was not a fraud. She was a whistleblower." The comeback was instantaneous. The public sentiment flipped like a coin. The hashtag "I stand with Caleb" exploded across the U.S. Caleb sat in the newsroom, watching the screen as the IRS agents were ordered to leave his Aunt May's house. He watched as the handcuffs were taken off his Uncle Elias, but the best part was yet to come. The camera cut to a live feed of a silver Mercedes trying to flee toward the airport. It was Julian Vance, but the road was blocked. Not by police cars, but by dozens of people, ordinary people who had seen the news. They stood in the middle of the street, blocking his path. Julian honked his horn, screaming at them, his face distorted with a final, pathetic rage. Then, the blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror. This time, the police weren't there to help him. The darkest hour had passed. The seed had grown through the dirt. As the sun began to peek through the clouds over Lake Michigan, Elias Rivers walked into the newsroom. He didn't look like a billionaire. He looked like a man who had finally found peace. He walked over to Caleb and pulled him into a hug that said more than any bank balance ever could. "You did it, champ," Elias whispered. "You carried the weight when I couldn't." "No, Uncle," Caleb said, looking down at his shoes, now soaked and ruined but still holding together. "Grandma carried us both." The comeback was complete. The truth had won. But the final chapter was about to be written, not in a bank and not in a newsroom, but in the hearts of everyone who had watched a boy in torn shoes change the world. Dust had finally settled over Chicago, but the world was different now. The scandal that had threatened to bury the Rivers' name had instead become the foundation of a revolution. Julian Vance was no longer a name spoken in the halls of power. It was a cautionary tale, whispered in boardrooms about the high cost of cruelty. He sat in a cell awaiting trial for embezzlement and civil rights violations, realizing too late that the street kid he mocked was the only one whose hands were truly clean. But for Caleb Rivers, the story wasn't about the man who fell. It was about the people who stood up. 6 months later, the glass doors of the bank, now renamed the Rivers Community Trust, opened once again. The marble was still there, polished and bright, but the atmosphere had changed. The air didn't feel cold or exclusive. It felt like home. In the center of the lobby, where Julian had once stood in his $500 tie, there was a new installation. It wasn't a statue of a billionaire or a display of gold bars. It was a simple glass case. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion, were a pair of torn, dirt-stained sneakers with frayed laces. Below the case, a bronze plaque read, "A person's worth is not measured by the shoes they wear, but by the path they choose to walk. In this house, dignity is the only currency." Elias Rivers stood at the podium, looking out at a crowd of journalists, community leaders, and ordinary citizens. Beside him stood Caleb, now taller, wearing a sharp navy suit. But if you looked closely at his feet, he wasn't wearing designer leather. He was wearing a brand new pair of simple, sturdy work boots, the kind his grandmother would have approved of. "My mother, Alina, spent 40 years being invisible," Elias told the crowd, his voice thick with emotion. "She was the help. She was the cleaning lady. She was the woman people walked past without a second glance. But while the world was looking past her, she was looking forward. She was building a bridge for a boy she knew she would never see grow up." He turned to Caleb. "Today, We launched the Alina Rivers Foundation. We aren't just giving away money. We are providing shoes, clothes, and tuition for every child who has been told they don't belong. We are making sure that no child ever has to stand in a lobby and feel small because of their bank balance." As the crowd erupted in applause, Caleb stepped forward to the microphone. He didn't have a prepared speech. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the original letter from his grandmother, the one that had survived the rain and the raids. "My grandma told me that respect is the baseline of humanity," Caleb said, his voice echoing with a maturity far beyond his years. "She said that some people measure you by your wallet, but the rare ones measure you by your character. I want to thank the people who chose to be rare. I want to thank the guard who stayed silent but stood tall, and the journalist who spoke when everyone else whispered." Caleb looked directly into the camera lens, his eyes piercing through the screen to the millions watching across America. To anyone out there who feels like they are wearing torn shoes today, stay in the race. Don't let their laughter slow you down, because the ground you are walking on today is the foundation of the kingdom you will build tomorrow. The ceremony ended, but the impact was just beginning. The Rivers Community Trust became the first bank in the country to implement a dignity-first policy, where every employee was trained not just in finance, but in empathy. Marcus Thorne, the security guard who had once stayed silent, was now the head of security for the entire foundation, ensuring that every person who walked through those doors was greeted with a smile and a handshake, regardless of their clothes. As the sun set over the lake, casting a golden glow over the city, Caleb walked out of the bank one last time as a child. He was heading toward his future, a future of college, of leadership, and of honoring the woman who gave everything for a boy in torn shoes. This story isn't just about Caleb, it's about you. Every day we walk past people we've already judged. We look at the clothes, the skin, the status, and we decide who matters. But remember the marble lobby. Remember how quickly the powerful fell and how high the lowly rose. If this story reminded you that character is the true measure of a man, then I have one request. Don't just watch this video and move on. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to join a community that values heart over heels. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been judged for how you looked? Or have you ever regretted staying silent when someone else was being mocked? Your story could be the strength someone else needs to hear today. Share this video, not for the views, but for the next kid sitting on a cold bench, waiting for someone to see their worth. Dignity is not given, it is carried. How will you carry yours today?